She was holding a letter that was never meant for her, written by a man who had never asked for her, never dreamed of her face, never imagined her calloused hands. Her sister had run away with a traveling salesman and $50 stolen from Evelyn's own savings. Now her father's order echoed in her ears. "You will go instead." 48 hours. That's all the time she had before standing before Jonah Reed and confessing the truth. She was not the bride he'd been promised. But here's what no one told her. Jonah Reed was a man destroyed by fire. His wife, his 3-year-old daughter, burned alive while he was miles away. And the man who did it? Still walking free, still smiling, still wanting Jonah's land. Now Evelyn must decide. Confess her deception and be sent back to nothing, or stay and become the target of a killer who has already murdered one family. But the real question isn't whether she'll survive. It's whether two people who've lost everything can teach each other how to love again. Stay until the end. Because the truth she discovers will shatter everything and rebuild it stronger. The lesson. This story will show you that sometimes being someone's second choice is actually being exactly where you were meant to be all along, and that the bravest thing you can do is tell the truth when lying would be easier. If this story speaks to you, comment below. Have you ever been underestimated only to prove everyone wrong? Hit like to share this message with someone who needs it. Share with anyone who's ever felt like a replacement but turned out to be irreplaceable. And subscribe, because we believe the best stories are the ones that remind you. Your worth isn't determined by who chose you first, but by who chooses to stay. The stagecoach groaned to a stop, and Evelyn Moore felt her breath lock in her chest. In her lap lay a folded letter, creased from being read 100 times. It was never meant for her. The words belonged to another woman, written by a man who had never asked for Evelyn, never dreamed of her face, never imagined her calloused hands or her stubborn heart. 48 hours. That was all the time she had before she would stand before Jonah Reed and confess the truth. She was not the bride he had been promised. She stared at the dust coating her worn boots and made herself a quiet promise. She would tell him everything the moment she arrived, even if it sent her straight back east, even if it cost her the only escape she had ever known. The morning her life shattered had begun before sunrise in a cramped farmhouse in eastern Kansas. The air hung thick with the smell of cold ash and years of resentment. Evelyn stood at the bottom of the stairs as her father's voice thundered through the thin walls. "She is gone." Evelyn did not need to see the empty bed upstairs to know who her father meant. Lillian, her younger sister. Beautiful, restless Lillian, who had always looked westward in her dreams, while reaching eastward for something finer than dirt and sweat could offer. Her father's boots paced the kitchen floor like the ticking of a clock counting down to disaster. A crumpled contract lay crushed in his fist. "Read it," he ordered. Evelyn unfolded the note with numb fingers. Lillian's handwriting looped across the page in soft, confident strokes. Careless strokes. "I cannot bury myself on some lonely ranch. I will not watch my life disappear into dirt and silence. Thomas is taking me to Chicago. Please forgive me." Her stepmother Agnes let out a quiet sob that broke the room open. But there was no warmth in that sound. Agnes had never loved Evelyn, only tolerated her. The tears were for Lillian, the favorite daughter, now vanished into the morning mist with a traveling salesman and $50 stolen from Evelyn's own savings. 4 days, her father said at last. His voice had gone flat and dangerous. 4 days until Jonah Reed expects a bride in Red Willow Valley. Evelyn felt the words before she understood them. "You will go instead." The sentence landed like a verdict from a hanging judge. Her stepmother tried to protest, but Harold Moore did not listen. The money was already spent, the seed bought, the farm was barely breathing, and this contract was its last gasp of air. "He asked for Lillian," Evelyn said softly. "He has never seen me." "He asked for a wife," her father snapped. "Someone strong, someone useful." Useful. That word had followed Evelyn her entire life like a shadow she could never outrun. Not beautiful, not precious, not loved, just useful. That afternoon, she packed Lillian's trunk, embroidered linens that did not belong to her, a fine wool coat she had never worn, a Bible with another woman's name pressed into the leather. Nothing in that trunk had ever been hers. That night, she read Jonah Reed's letters for the first time. They were not romantic. They were honest, stark, careful. Words written by a man who measured each sentence the way a rancher might measure rainfall. "I will not promise ease," he had written to Lillian, "but I will promise respect. I need a partner, not a decoration. If you cannot accept hard work and honest living, do not come." Evelyn read those words again and again by candlelight. Something about them felt different from every promise she had ever been given. Different from Marcus, the man who had courted her 2 years ago before meeting Lillian at a church social. Marcus had promised her love, then chosen her sister within a single afternoon. Jonah Reed promised nothing but respect and hard work. Somehow that felt more honest than any declaration of love she had ever heard. By dawn, Evelyn Moore boarded a westbound stagecoach with borrowed belongings and a borrowed future. Ahead of her waited a man who expected someone else entirely, and she was running out of time to decide whether courage would save her or ruin her completely. The journey west took 4 punishing days. Evelyn learned the sound of bones knocking against wood, the smell of sweat and leather, the way time stretched when fear had nowhere to go. She spoke little. She watched the land change instead. Fields thinned into prairie. Prairie rose into broken country. The sky grew so wide it made her feel small and exposed, like a single blade of grass beneath an endless blue ocean. At night, she dreamed of a man's eyes she had never seen, eyes that would take one look at her and know she was not the woman he had chosen. On the 4th afternoon, the driver called out the words that stopped her heart. Red Willow Valley. The town appeared suddenly, a scatter of buildings pressed against the earth as if bracing for wind. A general store with faded letters on its sign, a saloon with piano music drifting through swinging doors, a small white church with a crooked steeple. Beyond it all, ranch land stretched toward distant hills, quiet and unforgiving under the afternoon sun. Evelyn's legs shook as she stepped down from the stagecoach. "Miss Moore." She turned to see a woman approaching, mid-50s, sturdy with kind eyes and hair pinned back without vanity. The woman wore a practical dress and moved with the confidence of someone who had survived hard years and come out stronger. "I am Mrs. Eliza Grant," the woman said gently. "I was asked to meet you." Evelyn swallowed hard. "You were expecting my sister." Mrs. Grant hesitated. Just a breath, long enough to confirm the truth. "Yes," she admitted. "The letters described someone different. I am not her." Evelyn kept her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. "And I need to tell him that myself." Mrs. Grant studied her for a long moment. Something shifted in those kind eyes. Not pity, but something closer to respect. "He is waiting at my house," Mrs. Grant said at last. Jonah thought it best to keep the town out of it. Folks around here have sharp eyes and sharper tongues. They walked in silence through the dusty main street. Every step felt like walking toward judgment. Evelyn noticed men outside the saloon watching her with curious eyes. A woman in a bonnet paused her sweeping to stare. In a town this small, a stranger was an event. Mrs. Grant pointed toward a large ranch house visible on a distant hill. "That is the Crane spread," she said quietly. "Victor Crane. He owns most of the land around here." Something in her tone made Evelyn look more carefully at the woman's face. "You do not like him." Mrs. Grant's expression hardened. "He and Jonah have history." "That is not my story to tell. Just remember my words. Never trust anything Victor Crane says." They reached a modest house near the edge of town. Neat fence, clean windows, a home that had been loved by someone who understood that love meant maintenance and care. Mrs. Grant opened the door and called out, "Jonah, she is here!" Heavy footsteps sounded from somewhere inside. Slow, measured, the footsteps of a man who did not rush for anyone or anything. Evelyn straightened her spine and stepped across the threshold into whatever future awaited her. The room was simple and warm, a stone fireplace, a worn wooden table, shelves lined with books and practical tools. And there, in the doorway leading to a back room, stood Jonah Reed. He was taller than his photograph had suggested, broad-shouldered, weathered by sun and wind, and something heavier than either. His hair was dark with silver already touching the edges. His face had been shaped by labor rather than softness. But it was his eyes that stopped Evelyn's breath. They were calm, watchful, not unkind, but guarded. The eyes of a man who had learned to expect disappointment and had built walls against it. In his hand he held a single wildflower, already wilting. He had picked it to welcome his bride. And in that moment, before he could speak, before anyone could fill the silence with comfortable lies, Evelyn made her choice. "Mr. Reed," she said, her voice clear despite the fear pounding in her chest. "My name is Evelyn Moore. I am not the woman you were promised. My sister ran away, and I was sent in her place." The wildflower trembled slightly in Jonah's hand. He looked at her for a long moment, then slowly, carefully, set the flower down on the table beside him. Like setting down a hope he had not even realized he was carrying. The silence stretched between them, heavy with everything that would come next. And Evelyn waited for the verdict that would determine whether her courage had saved her or destroyed her completely. The silence in Mrs. Grant's parlor stretched tight as a hangman's rope. Jonah Reed did not shout. He did not curse or demand explanations. He simply looked at Evelyn with those guarded eyes. And somehow that was worse than any explosion of anger would have been. "You know I could refuse," he said at last. His voice was low and controlled. "The agreement was made with your sister. I could send you back east with nothing but the shame of it." "Yes." Evelyn kept her chin up, even as her heart hammered against her ribs. "And I would go without complaint. Why tell me the truth?" Jonah took one step closer, studying her face as if searching for the lie beneath her words. "You could have pretended to be Lillian. I have never met her. I would not have known. Because if you discovered the deception later," Evelyn said quietly, "the betrayal would be worse than the disappointment now." "I have been lied to enough in my life, Mr. Reed. I will not build my future on the same foundation." Something flickered in his eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or the first faint spark of respect. Mrs. Grant cleared her throat softly. "Jonah, perhaps we should all sit down and discuss this properly." "No." Jonah did not look away from Evelyn. "Let her finish. I want to hear everything." Evelyn drew a slow breath. Her hands wanted to tremble, so she clasped them together in front of her. "I am not what you expected," she said. "I know that. I am not delicate or beautiful like my sister. But I have worked a farm since I was a girl. I can cook. I can keep accounts. I can tend animals and mend fences and work from dawn until dark without complaining. I will not pretend to be anyone other than who I am." The words left her feeling hollow and exposed, like she had stripped away every protective layer and stood before this stranger in nothing but the truth. Jonah turned away, crossing to the window. Outside, dust rolled low across the road. A dog barked somewhere in town. Ordinary sounds stretched thin by the weight of waiting. On the windowsill, Evelyn noticed something that made her breath catch. A small cloth doll, faded and worn. A child's toy kept with obvious care. Mrs. Grant moved closer to Evelyn and spoke in a low voice. "He lost his wife and daughter 5 years ago. A fire. He does not speak of it, but the grief never left him." Evelyn's chest tightened. The letters had never mentioned this. Jonah had revealed nothing of his past pain to the woman he hoped to marry. "I did not send for a wife to decorate my house," Jonah said suddenly, still facing the window. "I sent for a partner, Someone who could stand beside me when things go wrong, and they go wrong out here more often than not. He turned back to her then, and something in his expression had shifted. Not softer, but deeper, more careful. I will not decide today, he continued. You have traveled too far. You are exhausted. I will not bind either of us to something we do not understand yet. Evelyn's knees nearly buckled with relief. What are you saying? A trial. Jonah's voice remained steady. 2 weeks. You will stay here at Mrs. Grant's boarding house, not at the ranch. We will avoid scandal that way. But you will work at my spread during the days. I will see if what you say about yourself is true. Mrs. Grant frowned. Jonah, people will talk regardless. They always do. Jonah looked back at Evelyn. If at the end of 2 weeks you want to leave, I will pay your passage and give you enough money to start over somewhere new. If I decide this arrangement will not work, I will do the same. And if we both agree to stay, then we marry, Jonah said simply. Properly, with witnesses and a preacher. No more pretending. The room felt suddenly smaller, warmer, more real than anything Evelyn had experienced in years. I would like that, she said before doubt could stop her. Jonah's brow lifted slightly. You understand that means real work. Hard work. The kind that breaks soft people. I did not come west to be protected, Mr. Reed. I came to be useful, to be seen for who I actually am. Something like approval flickered across his weathered face. It disappeared as quickly as it came, but Evelyn saw it. And that brief flash meant more to her than any flowery compliment ever could. Then we leave for the ranch before sunset, Jonah said. It is a long ride. Mrs. Grant will bring you out tomorrow morning. He moved toward the door, then stopped with his hand on the frame. Miss Moore? Yes? Jonah did not turn around. That was the bravest thing anyone has told me in a long time. Most people lie when the truth is hard. You did not. He walked out before she could respond. Mrs. Grant let out a long breath. Well, that could have gone much worse. Evelyn sank into the nearest chair. Her legs had finally given out. He did not send me away. Number. Mrs. Grant smiled gently. He did not. That man has been dead inside for 5 years. Today is the first time I have seen him look at anyone like they might be worth knowing. That evening, Mrs. Grant showed Evelyn to a small room at the back of the boarding house. Simple furnishings, a narrow bed, a single window looking out toward the distant hills. The Crane Ranch is up there, Mrs. Grant said, pointing to a large spread visible in the fading light. Victor Crane owns more land than anyone in the valley. He has wanted Jonah's property for years. Why? Water rights. Mrs. Grant's voice hardened. Jonah's land has the best springs in the region. Crane has tried everything to get them. Legal tricks, offers that sound generous but hide traps. When those failed, he tried other methods. What kind of methods, Mrs.? Kind of methods. Grant hesitated. That is not my story to tell, dear. But be careful around Victor Crane. He smiles like a friend and thinks like a snake. After Mrs. Grant left, Evelyn sat alone in the gathering darkness. Through the window, she could see the distant lights of Jonah's ranch house, a single lamp burning against the night. He had kept his daughter's doll for 5 years. He visited their graves every Sunday. He had written letters asking for a partner, not a decoration. This was not a man incapable of love. This was a man who had loved so deeply that losing it had nearly destroyed him. Evelyn pulled the worn blanket around her shoulders and made another promise to herself. She would not just survive this trial. She would prove that she was worth choosing, not as a replacement for someone else, but as herself. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the scent of sage and coming rain. Somewhere in the darkness, a coyote called to its pack, and Evelyn Moore, for the first time in her life, felt like she might be exactly where she was meant to be. Dawn broke cold and pink over Red Willow Valley. Evelyn arrived at Jonah's ranch before the sun had fully cleared the eastern hills. She had borrowed a practical dress from Mrs. Grant and pinned her hair back tight. No ribbons, no vanity, just a woman ready to work. Jonah stood on the porch with a tin cup of coffee in his hand. His expression gave nothing away, but something in his posture shifted when he saw her walking up the dirt path. "You are early," he said. "I am used to it." He handed her a cup without ceremony. The coffee was strong and bitter, exactly what she needed to shake off the morning chill. The ranch spread out before her in the growing light, a sturdy log house built for function rather than beauty, a large barn in good repair, fences that stood straight because someone cared enough to mend them properly. In the distance, cattle grazed in scattered groups across the golden grass. One corner of the property caught Evelyn's attention, a small garden plot overgrown with weeds. It looked abandoned, forgotten. "That was Margaret's," Jonah said quietly, following her gaze. "My wife. She grew vegetables there. I have not had the heart to tend it since." Evelyn nodded but did not offer empty comfort. Some wounds could not be healed with words. Two men emerged from the barn, wiping their hands on their trousers. The younger one had a quick smile and curious eyes. The older one moved with the careful economy of someone who had spent decades doing hard labor. "Ben Cooper," Jonah said, nodding toward the younger man. "And Luke Dawson. They have worked this ranch with me for years." Ben grinned at Evelyn. "Well now, the boss actually brought a woman to the ranch. I thought I would die of old age before seeing that." "She is here to work," Jonah said flatly. "Not to listen to your foolishness." Luke just nodded politely. "Ma'am?" Ben's grin widened. "So what can you do, Miss Moore? Cook? Sew? Look pretty on the porch?" "I can rope, ride, and shoot," Evelyn replied without hesitation. "I can birth a calf and break a horse and balance a ledger book. Would you like a demonstration?" Ben blinked in surprise. Luke let out a rare chuckle. Jonah's expression did not change, but something in his eyes warmed slightly. "She says she can ride," Jonah said. "Let us see if she's telling the truth." He led her to the stable where a bay mare waited, already saddled. The horse had intelligent eyes and a calm temperament. "Her name is Willow. She does not spook easy. Treat her fair and she will do the same." Evelyn ran her hand along the mare's neck, feeling the warmth and muscle beneath the coat. She checked the saddle, adjusted the stirrups, and swung up onto Willow's back with practiced ease. No side saddle, no delicate perching. She sat the horse like someone who had been riding since childhood. Jonah watched without comment. Then he mounted his own horse and led the way out toward the open range. They spent the morning checking fences and counting cattle. The work was familiar to Evelyn, the rhythm of riding and watching and noting which animals looked healthy and which might need attention. The land itself took her breath away. Rolling grasslands stretched to the horizon, broken only by scattered trees and rocky outcrops. The sky arched overhead so vast it made her feel both insignificant and strangely free. Around mid-morning, Evelyn spotted a cow standing apart from the herd. The animal's gait was uneven, favoring her front left leg. "That one is injured," Evelyn said, pointing. Jonah looked where she indicated, then nodded. "Good eye. Let us take a look." They approached slowly, not wanting to spook the animal. Up close, Evelyn could see the problem. A stone had lodged itself in the cow's hoof, causing pain with every step. Without waiting for instruction, Evelyn dismounted and moved toward the cow with calm, deliberate steps. She spoke softly, keeping her voice low and soothing. "Easy now. Easy, girl. Just going to help you out." The cow watched her with suspicious eyes, but did not bolt. Evelyn ran her hand along the animal's flank, then bent to examine the hoof. The stone was wedged deep, but she had dealt with this problem dozens of times on her father's farm. She pulled a small folding knife from her pocket and worked carefully, prying the stone loose without cutting into the sensitive tissue. The cow flinched once, but held steady under Evelyn's gentle touch. "There." She straightened up, holding the offending stone. "That should feel better now." Jonah had not dismounted. He sat on his horse, watching her with an expression she could not read. "You did not wait for me to tell you what to do," he said finally. The animal was in pain. Waiting would not have helped. For a long moment, Jonah simply looked at her. Then he nodded once. "Good," he said. That was the right call. It was not exactly praise, but from a man as guarded as Jonah Reed, it felt like a victory. They continued their ride, following a path that wound through a narrow canyon. The walls rose steep on either side, casting cool shadows across the trail. That was when the riders appeared. 5 men on horseback blocked the path ahead. At their center sat a man who stood out from the others like a peacock among crows. His clothes were finer than anything worn by working ranchers. His horse was a gleaming black stallion worth more than most homesteads. He smiled when he saw Jonah, but the expression never reached his eyes. "Jonah Reed." The man's voice carried across the distance, smooth and confident. "I heard you had a visitor from back east. Thought I would come introduce myself." Jonah's posture went rigid. Evelyn could feel the tension radiating from him like heat from a fire. "Crane," Jonah said flatly. "This is not your land." Victor Crane laughed, a pleasant sound that somehow managed to feel threatening. "Just being neighborly." He turned his attention to Evelyn, looking her over with obvious appraisal. "And who might this lovely creature be?" "Not your concern," Jonah said, before Evelyn could respond. Crane's smile widened. "Come now, we are all friends here." He urged his horse forward a few steps. "Miss, if you are looking for better accommodations than what Reed can offer, my ranch has plenty of room. Much more comfortable than this dusty little spread." Evelyn met his gaze directly. She had known men like Victor Crane all her life, men who smiled while calculating how to take what they wanted. "Thank you for the offer," she said calmly, "but I am exactly where I choose to be." Something flickered in Crane's eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or annoyance at finding his charm ineffective. "Choices can change," he said softly. "People often regret the decisions they make in haste." He looked at Jonah with that same pleasant smile. "You know where to find me, Reed. My offer still stands. Sell me your water rights and all your troubles disappear." "Get off my path," Jonah said. For a moment, the air crackled with unspoken threat. Then Crane laughed again and turned his horse. "Until next time, neighbor." The 5 riders disappeared back through the canyon, leaving dust and silence in their wake. Jonah did not speak for several minutes. When he finally turned to Evelyn, his expression was grimmer than she had seen it. "Victor Crane is dangerous," he said quietly. "More dangerous than he looks. Stay away from him." "What does he want with your land?" "Water." Jonah's voice hardened. "The springs on my property are the best in the valley. He has tried legal tricks and false offers to get them. When those failed, he moved on to other methods." "What kind of methods?" Jonah did not answer. But something in his silence told Evelyn everything she needed to know. They rode back to the ranch house as the afternoon sun began its descent toward the western hills. Evelyn's muscles ached from hours in the saddle, but it was a good ache, the ache of honest work. In the kitchen, she took over supper preparations without asking permission. Simple food: beans, bread, salt, pork with herbs she found in Mrs. Grant's supplies. Nothing fancy, but seasoned properly and cooked with care. When Ben and Luke sat down to eat, their eyebrows rose in surprise. "Lord Almighty," Ben said through a mouthful of food. "Someone who actually knows how to use a salt shaker." Even Luke grunted what might have been approval. Jonah ate in silence, but he cleaned his plate. And when Evelyn rose to wash the dishes, he stopped her. "You have done enough today," he said. "Rest. I do not mind the work, I know, but you have nothing left to prove, not today." Their eyes met across the simple kitchen. Something passed between them in that moment. Not romance, not yet, but the first fragile threads of understanding. Later, Mrs. Grant arrived with a wagon to take Evelyn back to the boarding house. As they passed the small cemetery at the edge of town, the older woman slowed the horses. "That is where they are buried," she said softly. "Margaret and little Hannah. Jonah visits every Sunday morning without fail." Evelyn looked at the 2 small headstones, barely visible in the fading light. A wife, a daughter, a family destroyed by something Jonah still would not name. "He says he cannot love anymore," Evelyn said quietly. But a man who visits his family's graves every week has not stopped loving. He has just stopped believing he deserves to. Mrs. Grant looked at her with new respect. You see more than most people, Evelyn Moore. That might be exactly what Jonah Reed needs. The wagon rolled on through the gathering darkness. And Evelyn began to understand that this trial was about far more than proving she could work a ranch. It was about two broken people learning whether they could heal each other. 1 week passed in a rhythm of hard work and careful observation. Evelyn rose before dawn each day and walked to the ranch through the cool morning air. She learned the names of the horses and the quirks of the cattle. She took over the account books and discovered years of disorganized records that she slowly began to untangle. Jonah watched her work without comment, but she noticed small changes. He started bringing her coffee without being asked. He answered her questions about the ranch with more than one-word responses. Once, when they were mending a fence together, their hands brushed over the same piece of wire. Both of them pulled back quickly. But Evelyn felt the brief contact like a spark jumping between them. Ben noticed the change in his employer. You know, he told Evelyn one afternoon while they were cleaning tack in the barn, I have worked for Jonah going on 4 years now. Never seen him talk this much to anyone except his horse. He is not exactly chatty, Evelyn replied with a small smile. For Jonah? This is practically a sermon. Ben's expression grew more serious. Whatever you are doing, Miss Moore, keep doing it. That man has been dead inside since the fire. Seeing him come alive again means something. The fire. Everyone mentioned it, but no one told her the full story. That afternoon, Jonah rode into town for supplies, leaving Evelyn to organize the storage shed. Years of accumulated equipment had been shoved into the small space without any system. She spent hours sorting tools, stacking crates, and sweeping out dust. In a dark corner behind a pile of old horse blankets, she found a wooden box. It was not locked. Later, she would tell herself she had not meant to pry. She had only wanted to see if the box contained more tools that needed organizing. But when she lifted the lid, she found something else entirely. Papers. A death certificate for Margaret Ellen Reed, age 28, another for Hannah Grace Reed, age 3. The cause of death on both documents read the same: fire. Beneath the certificates lay a sheriff's report. Evelyn read it with growing horror. Investigation into fire at Reed Homestead. Probable cause determined to be overturned oil lamp. No evidence of foul play found. Case closed. But someone had written in the margin with angry slashing strokes. Lies. Someone set that fire. I will find proof. At the bottom of the box, wrapped in cloth, lay a fragment of burned fabric. Evelyn unfolded it carefully. The material had once been part of a jacket or coat. Most of it was destroyed, but one corner remained intact enough to show an embroidered letter. The letter C. Evelyn's hands began to shake. She thought of Victor Crane with his fine clothes and cold smile. She thought of Jonah's warning to stay away from him. She put everything back exactly as she had found it, and closed the box. That evening, she could not stop thinking about what she had discovered. After supper at the boarding house, she found Mrs. Grant sitting alone on the porch, watching the stars emerge. May I ask you something? Mrs. Grant patted the chair beside her. You found something today. I can see it on your face, the fire that killed Jonah's family. Evelyn sat down heavily. He does not believe it was an accident. Mrs. Grant was quiet for a long moment. Then she sighed. Jonah was away that night. A cattle deal in a town 2 days' ride from here. Margaret and Hannah were alone at the ranch. By the time anyone saw the flames, it was too late. And Jonah thinks someone started it deliberately? He knows someone did. Mrs. Grant's voice dropped low. A neighbor saw a rider leaving the property just before the fire started, but when the sheriff investigated, suddenly no one remembered seeing anything. Witnesses changed their stories. Evidence disappeared. Victor Crane. Mrs. Grant did not confirm or deny, but her silence was answer enough. Crane wanted those water rights even then, she finally said. Jonah refused to sell. A month later, his wife and daughter were dead. Evelyn felt sick to her stomach. And nothing was ever done? Crane has money, influence. Half the people in this valley owe him something. The other half are scared of what might happen if they speak up. Then why does Jonah stay? Why not sell and leave this place behind? Mrs. Grant smiled sadly. Because if he leaves, Crane wins. And because this land is all Jonah has left of the life he built with Margaret. Every fence, every building, every inch of soil, they work together. He cannot abandon that. Evelyn stared out at the darkness beyond the porch light. A decision crystallized in her mind. If she stayed, she would not just be entering a marriage. She would be entering a war. But instead of fear, she felt something unexpected. Purpose. For the first time in her life, someone needed her not just for the work her hands could do, but for the strength her presence could provide. Jonah Reed was fighting a battle he could not win alone. And Evelyn Moore had never walked away from a fight that mattered. That night, she made a choice that would change everything. She went to the ranch. The lamp in Jonah's window still burned when she arrived. She found him sitting on the porch steps, a half-empty bottle of whiskey beside him. His eyes were distant, lost in memories she could only imagine. "You should not be here," he said without looking up. "It is late. People will talk. Let them." Evelyn sat down beside him, close enough to feel the warmth of his shoulder. "I found the box in the storage shed. I saw the report. And the fabric." Jonah's body went rigid. "You had no right to look at that. I know, and I am not sorry." He finally turned to face her. In the lamplight, his eyes held a pain so deep it took her breath away. "Now you understand," he said quietly. "This is not a safe place, Evelyn. Crane killed my family, and everyone knows it, but no one can prove it. He will not stop until he has this land. If you stay here, if you tie yourself to me, you become a target too." Evelyn met his gaze without flinching. "I have been unwanted my whole life," she said slowly. "Every man I have known has either used me or cast me aside. My own father sold me to save his farm. My sister stole the one person who ever seemed to care about me. I have spent 26 years being told I am useful but not valuable." She reached out and placed her hand over his. "You are the first person who has looked at me like I might be worth something more than the work I can do. I am not going to run away from that just because it is dangerous." Jonah stared at her hand resting on his. For a long moment he did not move. Then, slowly, he turned his palm upward and wrapped his fingers around hers. "They should not," he said hoarsely. "My daughter would have been 8 this year. Some days I still hear her laughing in the house. I loved Margaret more than I knew it was possible to love anyone. Losing them broke something inside me." Evelyn nodded. "And you think loving again means betraying their memory?" Jonah's jaw tightened. "I think loving again means risking that kind of loss all over again. I do not know if I can survive it twice." "Then do not think about love," Evelyn said softly. "Think about partnership. Think about 2 people standing together against someone who wants to destroy them both." She squeezed his hand. "I am not asking for your heart, Jonah Reed. I am asking for your trust. Can you give me that much?" The silence stretched between them, filled with cricket song and distant cattle sounds. Finally, Jonah exhaled a breath he seemed to have been holding for 5 years. "Hannah would have liked you," he said quietly. "She loved wildflowers too. Margaret used to plant them all around the house." He reached into his pocket and pulled out the small cloth doll Evelyn had seen in Mrs. Grant's parlor. This was hers. "I have carried it every day since the fire." He looked at the doll with infinite tenderness. "Maybe it is time to let her rest." He set the doll on the porch railing, propped up so it seemed to be watching the stars. "Good night, sweetheart," he whispered. And for the first time since Evelyn had met him, she saw tears slide down Jonah Reed's weathered face. She did not offer comfort. She did not try to fill the silence with empty words. She simply sat beside him in the darkness, her hands still wrapped in his. Two broken people, beginning to believe they might be able to heal. The drought arrived without warning. 3 weeks passed with no rain. The creek that ran through Jonah's property slowed to a trickle, then stopped entirely. Grass that had been golden turned brown and brittle. The cattle grew restless, sensing the danger that their human keepers could only calculate. "We need to move them to water," Jonah said one morning, studying the cloudless sky. "But the nearest reliable source is on Crane's land. There has to be another option." Evelyn spread old survey maps across the kitchen table, tracing boundaries and waterways with her finger. "What about this area here? These markings suggest underground springs." Jonah leaned over her shoulder, close enough that she could smell soap and leather. "That is government land. No one has ever confirmed if those springs actually exist. Then we need to find out. We cannot afford to depend on Crane's generosity." The word generosity dripped with sarcasm. They both knew any deal with Victor Crane would cost far more than it was worth. Ben and Luke joined them at the table. The four of them spent the morning planning. According to the old maps, the potential springs lay about 2 miles north of Jonah's boundary. If they could dig a well and strike water, they could pipe it down to the lower pastures. It was a gamble, but the alternative was watching the cattle die of thirst or surrendering to Crane's demands. They started digging the next day. The work was brutal. Summer's sun beat down without mercy. The ground was hard-packed and stubborn, yielding only inches at a time. Evelyn's hands blistered within the first hour. By the end of the first day, every muscle in her body screamed for rest. But she did not stop. None of them did. On the second day, Victor Crane appeared. He rode up with 2 of his men, watching the digging operation with an amused smile. "This is a fool's errand, Reed." He leaned on his saddle horn, perfectly comfortable in the shade of his hat while others sweated in the sun. "Those springs are a myth. Old-timers' tales. You're breaking your backs for nothing." Jonah did not stop digging. "We will see. I could end your problems today." Crane's voice turned silky smooth. "Sell me your water rights. I will let your cattle drink from my streams. Everyone benefits." Evelyn straightened up, shovel in hand, sweat dripping down her face. "What you are offering is not help," she said clearly. "It is robbery dressed up in neighborly words. We both know those water rights are worth more than you would ever pay." Crane's smile flickered. He turned his attention to her with new interest. "You have a mouth on you, woman. I also have common sense." Evelyn held his gaze without flinching. "Which is more than I can say for anyone who would trust you." The temperature seemed to drop despite the blazing sun. Crane's men shifted uncomfortably in their saddles. "You will regret this," Crane said quietly. "Both of you. When your cattle are dead and your land is worthless, remember that I offered you a way out." He turned his horse and rode away. But the threat lingered in the air like the smell of smoke. Jonah set down his shovel and walked over to Evelyn. His expression was unreadable. "That was foolish," he said. Evelyn braced herself for criticism. "And brave," he added. "No one has spoken to Victor Crane like that in years." Before Evelyn could respond, her legs buckled. The sun, the exertion, the lack of water suddenly caught up with her all at once. She would have fallen if Jonah had not caught her. Easy. His arms were strong and steady around her. Easy now. He carried her to the shade of a nearby tree and pressed a canteen to her lips. "Drink slowly, small sips." The water was warm, but felt like salvation sliding down her throat. She tried to stand, but Jonah kept a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Rest. We have pushed hard enough today. We cannot stop. The cattle need water, and you need to be alive to see them get it." His voice was firm but not unkind. "You do not have to destroy yourself to prove your worth, Evelyn. Not to me." Their eyes met. Something shifted between them, some wall that had been holding firm finally showing cracks. "I do not know how to stop," she admitted. "Proving myself is all I have ever done." "Then learn." Jonah's hand moved from her shoulder to her cheek, brushing away a strand of hair that had come loose. Because I would rather have you healthy than have you work yourself to death trying to impress me. It was the closest thing to tenderness he had shown her. Evelyn's heart pounded against her ribs. On the fourth day, they struck water. The moment the ground turned dark and damp, Ben let out a whoop that echoed across the valley. Luke actually smiled, something Evelyn had never seen before, and Jonah, standing beside the slowly filling hole, turned to Evelyn with wonder in his eyes. "You found it," he said. "These maps have been in that storage shed for 20 years. No one thought to actually check if the springs were real." "We found it," she corrected. "I just read the map. You did the digging." For a moment she thought he might reach for her again. Instead, he simply nodded, but the gratitude in his expression spoke louder than any embrace could have. That night, they gathered at Mrs. Grant's boarding house to celebrate. Clara Finch, who ran the general store, brought a cake she had baked herself. Sheriff Tom Harlan stopped by to congratulate them, his weathered face creased with genuine pleasure. For the first time since arriving in Red Willow, Evelyn felt like she belonged somewhere. After the others had gone home, Jonah walked Evelyn out to the porch. The stars overhead blazed with impossible brightness. "The 2 weeks are over," he said quietly. Evelyn's stomach tightened. She had been so focused on the water crisis that she had lost track of time. "Yes," she said, "I suppose they are. Do you want to leave?" She turned to face him. In the moonlight, his features seemed softer. The perpetual tension in his jaw finally eased. "Do you want me to?" Jonah was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was rough with emotion he was clearly not accustomed to expressing. "I thought I wanted a business arrangement, someone to help with the ranch and nothing more." He swallowed hard. "But somewhere in these 2 weeks, that stopped being enough. I do not know if I can offer you love, Evelyn. I do not know if I remember how. But I know that when I think about you leaving, it feels like losing something I cannot afford to lose again." Evelyn's eyes burned with unshed tears. "Then ask me to stay." Jonah took both her hands in his. They were rough and calloused, the hands of a man who had built his life through honest labor. "Stay," he said simply. "Not because of any contract. Not because your family sent you here. Stay because I am asking you. Because whatever this is between us, I want to see where it leads." The word "yes" rose to her lips. But before she could speak, the sound of hoofbeats interrupted the moment. A rider was approaching fast. The rider who interrupted their moonlit moment was not an enemy. It was Mrs. Grant's nephew bringing word from town. "There is a woman at the hotel," he said breathlessly. "Arrived on the evening stage. Says her name is Lillian Moore. Says she is looking for her sister." Evelyn felt the blood drain from her face. Lillian. Here. After all these weeks of building something new, the ghost of her past had finally caught up with her. Jonah's expression hardened. He looked at Evelyn with a question in his eyes. "My sister," Evelyn said quietly. "The one who was supposed to come here in my place. What does she want? I do not know, but I intend to find out." They rode into town together, though Jonah insisted on maintaining distance. Whatever was about to happen, he wanted Evelyn to face it on her own terms, not as his appendage. The Red Willow Hotel was really just a boarding house with pretensions. But standing on its narrow porch, wearing a silk dress that must have cost more than most families earned in a month, was Lillian Moore. She was beautiful. She had always been beautiful. Golden hair that caught even the dim lamplight. Delicate features that made men stumble over their own feet. A figure that seemed designed to make other women feel inadequate. But her eyes, when they met Evelyn's, held something unexpected. Not triumph, not cruelty, fear. "Sister." Lillian's voice trembled slightly. "I was not sure you would come. I almost did not." Evelyn kept her distance, years of hurt building a wall between them. "What are you doing here, Lillian? Last I heard, you were living the high life in Chicago with your traveling salesman." Lillian's composure cracked. "Thomas left me, took everything and disappeared. I have been working in a boarding house for 3 months, scrubbing floors and washing dishes. The reversal of fortune was so complete that Evelyn almost laughed. Almost. So you came here expecting what? That I would take you in? That the man you abandoned would welcome you with open arms? I came because I had nowhere else to go? Lillian's voice broke. And because I needed to apologize. The word hung in the air between them. In 22 years, Evelyn could not remember her sister ever apologizing for anything. I stole your money, Lillian continued, tears streaming down her perfect cheeks. I stole Marcus from you before that. I have taken and never given anything back. I know you hate me. You have every right to hate me. Evelyn's heart warred with itself. Part of her wanted to turn away, to let Lillian suffer the consequences of her own choices. But another part, the part that had survived years of loneliness and rejection, recognized the desperation in her sister's eyes. "Where is your husband?" Evelyn asked. "Daniel something?" Lillian flinched. "We are still married, technically. But he is in trouble with people in Chicago. Bad debts. Dangerous people. He told me to come west and lay low for a while. So this is not about apologies at all. It is about hiding. Both." Lillian wiped her eyes. "I know I do not deserve your help, but I did not know where else to go." Before Evelyn could respond, another voice cut through the night air. "Well, well, a family reunion." Victor Crane emerged from the shadows near the hotel entrance. He must have been watching the whole exchange. His smile was pleasant enough, but something predatory lurked beneath it. "Miss Lillian Moore, is it?" He tipped his hat with exaggerated courtesy. "I heard there was a beautiful stranger in town." Now I see the rumors were understated. Lillian looked confused. "Do I know you?" "Not yet. But I would very much like to change that." Crane stepped closer, positioning himself between the two sisters. "This valley can be unkind to women alone. I have a large ranch, plenty of room. I would be honored to offer you accommodations more suited to a lady of your obvious refinement." Evelyn felt ice form in her stomach. She knew exactly what Crane was doing. He had seen an opportunity and was moving to exploit it. "My sister already has accommodations," Evelyn said firmly. "She will be staying with Mrs. Grant." Crane's smile never wavered. "Of course. Just being neighborly." He looked at Lillian with eyes that promised everything and revealed nothing. "But if you change your mind, the offer stands." He vanished back into the darkness as smoothly as he had appeared. "Who was that?" Lillian asked, still looking confused. "Victor Crane." Evelyn took her sister's arm and began walking toward Mrs. Grant's boarding house. "The most dangerous man in Red Willow Valley. And if you have any sense at all, you will stay far away from him." Over the next several days, Evelyn watched her sister with wary eyes. Lillian seemed genuinely chastened by her fall from grace. She helped around the boarding house, washing dishes and sweeping floors without complaint. She spoke softly to Mrs. Grant and stayed out of Evelyn's way. But she also visited the general store frequently, and somehow her path always seemed to cross with Victor Crane's. "He is courting me," Lillian admitted one evening when Evelyn confronted her. "He has sent flowers, chocolates, notes telling me how beautiful I am. He is using you." Evelyn grabbed her sister's shoulders. "Listen to me, Lillian. Crane wants Jonah's land. He would do anything to get it, including seducing the sister of the woman Jonah is going to marry." "Marry?" Lillian's eyes widened. "You and the rancher?" "Yes." Evelyn had not intended to announce it this way, but there was no point in hiding it now. "He asked me to stay. I said yes." Something flickered across Lillian's face. Not quite jealousy, something more complex. "You actually found someone who wants you," she said quietly. "Not just someone who will settle for you because they cannot have me. Someone who chose you first." "Yes." Lillian was silent for a long moment. Then, unexpectedly, she smiled. "Good for you, sister. You deserve it more than I ever did." The words should have felt like victory, but something in Lillian's tone made Evelyn uneasy. Her sister had never given up anything without a fight. That night, Evelyn told Jonah about Crane's interest in Lillian. "He is planning something," she said, "using her to get to us somehow." Jonah nodded grimly. Sheriff Harlan mentioned the same thing. He has been watching Crane's movements, says there have been secret meetings at the saloon, men coming and going at odd hours. Can he do anything about it? Not without proof. Crane is too careful to leave evidence lying around. Evelyn thought about the fragment of burned fabric with its embroidered C. The proof Jonah needed had been destroyed along with his family. "Then we need to be more careful than he is," she said finally. "And we need to watch Lillian. I want to believe she has changed, but trust is earned, not given." Jonah pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her in a rare display of affection. "Whatever comes," he said quietly, "we face it together." "That was what you said, was it not?" Evelyn leaned into his embrace, drawing strength from his solid presence. "Together," she agreed. But even as she spoke the words, she could not shake the feeling that the storm building on the horizon was about to break. The clouds rolled in from the west like an army marching to war. Evelyn woke to darkness and the distant rumble of thunder. Through her window at Mrs. Grant's boarding house, she could see lightning flickering across the sky, illuminating the world in brief, violent flashes. A storm was coming. The biggest one Red Willow had seen in years. She dressed quickly and hurried downstairs to find Jonah already at the door, his face grim. "20 head of cattle are in the north pasture," he said without preamble. "First-time mothers. If the storm panics them, they will scatter or stampede. We could lose everything. I am coming with you. It is dangerous. You could be killed." Evelyn grabbed her coat from the hook by the door. "Then we will be in danger together." That was the deal. For a moment, Jonah looked like he might argue. Then something shifted in his eyes. Respect, perhaps, or recognition that this woman would not be left behind. "Stay close to me," he said, "no matter what." They rode into the teeth of the storm. Rain lashed at their faces like needles of ice. Wind screamed through the canyons, drowning out every sound except the constant roar of thunder. Lightning turned the world white, then plunged it back into darkness so complete that Evelyn could barely see her own hands on the reins. Willow was terrified, every muscle trembling, but the mare held steady under Evelyn's calming touch. They found the cattle scattered across the north pasture, wild-eyed and bawling. Calves had been separated from their mothers. Cows ran in blind panic, crashing through brush and over rocks. "We push them together," Jonah shouted over the storm. "Slow and steady. Guide them toward the canyon where they can shelter." For the next hour, Evelyn worked harder than she had ever worked in her life. Every gain felt temporary, every small victory immediately threatened by the next crash of thunder. Her voice went raw from shouting. Her clothes were soaked through. Her hands had gone numb from gripping the reins. But she did not stop. She could not stop. Then the lightning struck. A bolt hit a tree not 50 feet from where Jonah was riding. The crack of thunder came at the same moment, a sound so loud it seemed to split the world in half. Jonah's horse screamed and reared. Evelyn watched in horror as he lost his grip on the reins and tumbled backward out of the saddle. He hit the ground hard and did not get up. "Jonah!" Evelyn was off her horse and running before she even made the conscious decision to move. She found him lying in the mud, his face twisted with pain. His shoulder sat at an angle that made her stomach turn. "My shoulder," he gasped. "Dislocated. Maybe broken ribs. Can you ride?" "Not on my own." The rain pounded down around them. The cattle were still scattered. Ben and Luke were somewhere in the darkness, doing what they could. But Jonah needed help, and there was no one else to provide it. Evelyn made a decision. She grabbed Willow's reins and led the mare to where Jonah lay. With strength she did not know she possessed, she helped him to his feet and half lifted, half pushed him onto the horse. Then she swung up behind him, one arm wrapped around his waist to hold him steady. "I have you," she said in his ear. "Just hold on." They could not make it back to the ranch in this weather. But she remembered a line cabin, an old shelter used by ranchers during roundups. It was closer, and it would provide protection from the storm. She found it more by luck than skill, a dark shape barely visible through the driving rain. The door was swollen shut from moisture, but she kicked it open and guided Jonah inside. The cabin was small and dusty but dry. A pile of old blankets sat in one corner. A stone fireplace dominated one wall. Working quickly, Evelyn got a fire started with matches she found on the mantel. Then she turned her attention to Jonah. His shoulder was definitely dislocated. She had seen her father reset a similar injury once years ago. It was brutal work, but leaving it untreated would only make things worse. "This is going to hurt," she warned him. "Just do it." She positioned herself and pushed. Jonah let out a sound that would haunt her dreams for years. But the joint slid back into place with a sickening pop. His ribs were harder to assess. She bound them as best she could with strips torn from the old blankets. Then she wrapped him in every warm thing she could find and sat beside him, watching the fire crackle. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The storm raged outside, but inside the cabin, there was only warmth and the sound of breathing. "You came for me," Jonah said finally. His voice was hoarse from pain. "You could have kept working the cattle. Could have let Ben or Luke find me." "No." Evelyn took his hand in both of hers. "I could not." "Why?" "Because when I thought you might be dead, nothing else mattered. Not the cattle, not the ranch, not any of it. Only you." Jonah's eyes searched her face in the firelight. "I have been dead for 5 years," he said quietly. "Dead inside, where it counts. After Margaret and Hannah, I swore I would never let myself care about anyone that much again. The pain was too much. The risk was too great. And now? Now I think about you every morning before I open my eyes. I hear your voice in my head when you are not there. When you fell from exhaustion during the digging, I felt like someone had reached into my chest and squeezed my heart." He lifted his good hand to touch her face. "I do not know if this is love, Evelyn. I do not remember what love feels like. But I know that whatever I feel for you is stronger than anything I have felt in 5 years." Evelyn's tears mixed with the rain still dripping from her hair. "That is enough," she whispered. "That is more than enough." And there, in a line cabin in the middle of the worst storm Red Willow had seen in a decade, 2 broken people finally stopped hiding from each other. They did not kiss. The moment was too raw, too fragile for that. But Jonah pulled her close with his good arm, and she rested her head on his chest, listening to his heartbeat steady beneath her ear. Outside, the storm began to ease. The thunder grew distant. The rain softened from a roar to a whisper. When dawn finally broke, they emerged from the cabin to find the world washed clean and new. Ben and Luke had managed to save most of the cattle. The losses were smaller than feared. And when the 2 ranch hands saw Jonah and Evelyn walking toward them, leaning on each other for support, Ben let out a whoop that echoed across the valley. "I knew it," he shouted. "I knew you 2 would figure it out eventually." Jonah actually smiled. A real smile, the first Evelyn had ever seen. "Shut up and help me get home, Cooper." But there was no anger in his voice, only relief, and something that looked very much like hope. Recovery took time. Doc Whitmore confirmed that Jonah's ribs were cracked, not broken. His shoulder would heal, but he needed rest. For a man who had spent his entire adult life working from dawn until dusk, being confined to a chair on the porch was its own kind of torture. Evelyn moved into the ranch house to care for him. They maintained separate rooms to preserve propriety, but the pretense fooled no one. The whole town knew that Jonah Reed and his mail-order bride had found something real between them. The wedding was set for 6 weeks hence, time enough for Jonah to heal and for proper preparations to be made. But Victor Crane was not content to wait. One afternoon, while Evelyn was collecting eggs from the henhouse, Lillian appeared at the ranch. "We need to talk," she said. Her face was pale, her hands trembling slightly. "I have done something terrible." Evelyn's stomach dropped. "What have you done?" "Crane has been paying me." Lillian's voice cracked. He said he just wanted information about Jonah's routine, when the ranch hands would be away, where the cattle would be grazing. He said it was for business, that he was planning to make Jonah an offer and wanted to time it right. And you believed him? I wanted to believe him. Lillian's tears flowed freely now. He made me feel special, important, like I mattered. But last night, I overheard him talking to some men. They are planning to set fire to the ranch house tonight. Evelyn went cold. Fire. The same method Crane had used 5 years ago to murder Margaret and Hannah. How do you know this is real? How do I know you are not just playing another game? Because I saw what they did to Jake. Lillian's voice dropped to a whisper. One of Crane's old ranch hands. He was going to talk to the sheriff about the first fire. Tell him what he knew. They beat him half to death. He's at the doctor's house right now. Everything clicked into place. The witness Mrs. Grant had mentioned. The evidence that kept disappearing. Crane had been silencing anyone who might expose the truth. Why are you telling me this? Because I am tired of being a monster. Lillian grabbed Evelyn's hands. I know you will never forgive me. I know I do not deserve forgiveness. But I cannot let more people die because I was too vain and stupid to see what was happening right in front of me. For a long moment, Evelyn said nothing. Then she made her decision. Come with me. We need to tell Jonah. And then we need to see the sheriff. The meeting at the sheriff's office was tense. Tom Harlan listened to Lillian's confession with growing anger. I have suspected Crane for years, he admitted. But without proof, without witnesses willing to testify, my hands have been tied. Jake will testify, Lillian said. He told me so before they beat him. He has been carrying the guilt for 5 years. He wants to make it right. That is one witness. The sheriff shook his head. Crane will claim Jake is lying, that he has a grudge. Then we need to catch him in the act. Evelyn leaned forward. If he is planning to set fire to the ranch tonight, we let him think his plan is working. Then we catch him red-handed. Jonah, who had insisted on attending despite his injuries, spoke for the first time. You want to use my ranch as bait. I want to end this, once and for all. They laid their plans carefully. The ranch hands would hide in the barn with rifles. Sheriff Harlan would position deputies around the property. Jonah and Evelyn would make a show of going to bed early, then slip out the back to join the ambush. But there was one more piece to set in place. Evelyn found Lillian pacing nervously in Mrs. Grant's parlor. I need you to do something, Evelyn said. Crane still thinks you are on his side. I need you to confirm that everything is going according to plan. Tell him the house will be empty, that Jonah and I are staying in town for the night. Lillian went even paler. If he finds out I am lying, then do not let him find out. Evelyn's voice softened slightly. This is your chance, Lillian, to be something other than what you have always been, to prove that the person I saw crying on that hotel porch was real. For a long moment, Lillian said nothing. Then she straightened her spine and lifted her chin. Tell me exactly what to say. The night came clear and cold. Stars blazed overhead, indifferent to the drama unfolding below. Evelyn waited in the darkness near the barn, her heart pounding. Beside her, Jonah sat motionless, a rifle across his lap despite his injured shoulder. Ben and Luke were hidden nearby. The sheriff and his deputies had spread out around the property, invisible in the shadows. For an hour, nothing happened. Then 2 hours. Evelyn was beginning to wonder if Crane had somehow discovered their trap when she heard hoofbeats. 3 riders approached from the east. They moved slowly, trying to be quiet, but sound carried in the clear night air. The lead rider dismounted near the ranch house, carrying something that gleamed in the starlight. A can of kerosene. Evelyn recognized him even in the darkness. Victor Crane had come to do his dirty work personally this time. Now, Jonah whispered. Lanterns blazed to life all around the property. The riders were caught in a circle of light, surrounded by armed men. Victor Crane, Sheriff Harlan called out. You are under arrest for arson and attempted murder. Drop your weapons and step away from the house. For a moment, Crane stood frozen. Then his face twisted with rage. "You think this changes anything?" His voice was almost a snarl. "I own this valley. I own the judge. I own half the witnesses you could ever call. You do not own me." The voice came from behind Crane. He spun to see Jake, the former ranch hand, standing in the doorway of the barn. His face was battered and bruised, but his eyes were clear. "I was there the night you burned the Reed house," Jake said. "I held the horses while your men set the fire. I have lived with that guilt for 5 years. I heard Margaret Reed screaming as the flames took her. I heard that little girl crying for her daddy." "Shut up," Crane hissed. "Shut your lying mouth. I will not. Not anymore." Jake's voice grew stronger. "I will testify in court. I will tell everyone exactly what you did and who paid me to help do it. You can kill me if you want, but it is too late. I already wrote everything down and gave it to the sheriff." Crane lunged for Jake, but 3 deputies tackled him before he could take 2 steps. As they hauled him away in chains, Victor Crane locked eyes with Jonah. "This is not over, Reed." Jonah stepped forward, his injured arm pressed against his side. "Yes, it is." And for the first time in 5 years, Jonah Reed looked like a man who had finally found peace. The trial of Victor Crane lasted 3 days. Jake's testimony was devastating. He described in detail how Crane had hired men to set the fire, how they had waited until Jonah was miles away, how they had blocked the doors to ensure Margaret and Hannah could not escape. The courtroom was silent except for the sound of weeping. When the verdict came, it was unanimous. Guilty of murder, guilty of arson, guilty of conspiracy. Victor Crane would spend the rest of his life in prison. Jonah sat through the entire trial without expression. But that night, he and Evelyn rode to the cemetery where Margaret and Hannah were buried. He knelt between the 2 small headstones and bowed his head. "It is over," he said quietly. "The man who took you from me will never hurt anyone again." Evelyn stood a few feet away, giving him privacy. But Jonah reached back and took her hand, pulling her forward to kneel beside him. "This is Evelyn," he said to the headstones. "She saved me, not just from the fire, but from myself, from the darkness I was drowning in." He looked at Evelyn with tears on his weathered face. "I need to let you go now," he continued, speaking to his lost family. "Not because I will ever stop loving you, but because holding on to grief was killing me. And I have a chance now for something new, something real." He kissed his fingers and pressed them first to Margaret's headstone, then to Hannah's. "Rest easy, my loves. I will carry you in my heart forever." They walked back to the horses in silence. But something had shifted in Jonah's bearing. The weight he had carried for 5 years seemed lighter somehow. "Will you marry me?" he asked suddenly. Evelyn blinked. "You already asked me that. I asked you to stay. That is different." He took both her hands in his. "Evelyn Moore, will you be my wife? Not because of any contract, not because your family sent you here, not because I needed someone to help with the ranch, but because I love you. Because somewhere in the middle of all this chaos, I fell in love with you." Evelyn's heart felt too full to contain. "Yes," she whispered, "1,000 times yes." Jonah kissed her then, gentle and fierce at the same time. And Evelyn knew that whatever came next, she would never be alone again. The wedding took place on a perfect autumn afternoon. The whole town turned out, crowding into the small white church until people were standing in the aisles and spilling out the doors. Mrs. Grant wept openly in the front row. Ben stood beside Jonah as best man, unable to stop grinning. Clara Finch caught the bouquet and Ben's cheeks turned red as fire. But the moment everyone remembered was when Evelyn walked down the aisle. She wore a simple white dress that Clara had helped her make. Her hair was pinned up with a silver clip that had belonged to Margaret. Mrs. Grant had given it to her the night before. "She would want you to have it," the older woman had said. "You brought Jonah back to life. That is a gift beyond price." Evelyn walked alone. No father to give her away, no family to support her. She had chosen herself, and she was giving herself freely. When she reached the altar, Jonah took her hands. His eyes shone with a light she had never seen before. The preacher spoke words about love and commitment. Evelyn barely heard them. All she could see was Jonah's face. All she could feel was the warmth of his hands in hers. Then it was time for the vows. "I came to you as a replacement," Evelyn said, her voice clear and strong. "A substitute for someone who did not want to be here. I expected nothing except a chance to prove myself useful." She squeezed his hands. "But you saw me, not the woman I was supposed to be, but the woman I actually am. You gave me a chance to be more than useful. You gave me a chance to be loved." Jonah's voice was rough with emotion when he spoke. "I thought I would never love again. I thought that part of me died in the fire with Margaret and Hannah. But you proved me wrong. You showed me that the heart can heal, even when it seems broken beyond repair." He lifted her hands to his lips. "I do not promise an easy life," he continued. "I do not promise that there will never be hard times. But I promise to stand beside you through all of it. I promise to see you, truly see you, every single day for the rest of my life." The preacher pronounced them husband and wife. When Jonah kissed her, the whole church erupted in cheers. That night, after the celebration had wound down and the guests had gone home, Jonah carried Evelyn across the threshold of the ranch house. "Welcome home, Mrs. Reed." Evelyn looked around at the house that had seemed so cold and empty when she first arrived. Someone had hung new curtains in the windows. Flowers filled vases on every surface. The smell of fresh baking lingered in the air. "Home," she repeated. "I like the sound of that." Jonah set her down but did not let go. "I never thought I would have this again," he said quietly. "A family, a future, someone to grow old with." Evelyn reached up to touch his face. "You have it now. We have it. Together." Outside, the stars wheeled overhead in their eternal dance. The wind whispered through the grass, carrying the scent of sage and promise. And in the ranch house in Red Willow Valley, two people who had thought they would never find love discovered that the heart knows no limits, and second chances are the sweetest gifts of all. 1 year later. Spring came early to Red Willow Valley, painting the hillsides in shades of green and gold. The creek ran full and strong, fed by mountain snowmelt. Wildflowers bloomed in profusion around the ranch house, carefully tended by Evelyn in the garden that had once belonged to Margaret. Jonah found her there one afternoon, kneeling in the soft earth with dirt on her hands and a smile on her face. "The doctor confirmed it," she said without preamble. Jonah went still. "Confirmed what?" Evelyn stood and took his hands, pressing them to her belly. "You are going to be a father again." For a long moment, Jonah could not speak. Emotions warred across his face. Joy and fear and hope and grief, all tangled together like vines. "A baby," he whispered. "A baby." Evelyn's smile trembled. "Our baby." He pulled her into his arms, holding her tight against his chest. She could feel him shaking. "I thought I would never have this again," he said into her hair. "A child. A family. Are you afraid?" "Terrified. But also happier than I have been since before the fire." He pulled back to look at her face. "You have given me everything, Evelyn. A reason to live. A reason to hope. And now this." The news spread quickly through Red Willow. Mrs. Grant immediately began knitting baby clothes. Clara started planning a celebration. Even Sheriff Harlan, not known for sentiment, stopped by to offer congratulations. Lillian sent a letter from San Francisco, where she had moved after the trial. She was working in a dressmaker's shop, learning a trade, building a life that did not depend on her beauty or her ability to manipulate others. "I am happy for you," she wrote. "Truly happy. I know I do not deserve your forgiveness, but I hope someday you might find it in your heart to give it anyway. You are going to be a wonderful mother, better than I ever could have been." Evelyn read the letter twice, then set it aside without responding. Forgiveness would come in time, perhaps, but trust had to be earned, and Lillian had a long way to go. Summer brought the annual cattle drive, bigger and more profitable than any year before. The new railway spur made transport easier. Prices were high. By autumn, the Reed Ranch was more prosperous than it had ever been. But the true blessing came in winter. The baby arrived on a December night with snow falling soft and silent outside the window. Doc Whitmore delivered a healthy girl, red-faced and squalling, with her mother's stubborn chin and her father's dark eyes. Jonah held his daughter for the first time with tears streaming down his face. "She is perfect," he whispered. "Absolutely perfect. What should we name her?" He looked at Evelyn, then down at the tiny bundle in his arms. "Hannah," he said quietly. "Hannah Margaret Reed." "So she knows where she comes from." Evelyn nodded, her own tears falling freely. "Hannah it is." The years that followed were not always easy. Drought came again, and bad winters, and all the challenges that frontier life could offer. But Jonah and Evelyn faced them together, just as they had promised. Ben married Clara the following spring. They had 3 children of their own, and the two families grew up intertwined, more like kin than neighbors. Mrs. Grant finally accepted Dr. Whitmore's proposal after 5 years of courtship. She claimed she only said yes to stop him from asking. Sheriff Harlan retired and handed his badge to a younger man, but he still stopped by the Reed Ranch every Sunday for dinner. And Hannah grew up surrounded by love, never knowing the shadow that had once hung over her family, only knowing that her parents adored each other and her. On the 10th anniversary of their wedding, Jonah and Evelyn stood on the porch of their ranch house watching the sun set over Red Willow Valley. "Do you ever regret it?" Jonah asked. "Coming here as a replacement? Building a life in this hard place?" Evelyn leaned against him, feeling the solid warmth of his body. "Never," she said. "Not for a single moment." Inside the house, Hannah was practicing her letters at the kitchen table. The smell of supper cooking filled the air. Somewhere in the barn, Ben was singing an off-key song while he worked. "I was so angry when you arrived," Jonah admitted. "Angry at your sister for running. Angry at myself for thinking a mail-order bride could fix anything. Angry at the world for taking everything I loved. And now? Now I understand that God works in mysterious ways." He turned to face her, taking her hands in his. "If Lillian had come instead of you, I would still be dead inside. You saved me, Evelyn. Not just from Crane or from the fire. From myself." Evelyn reached up to touch his face, the face she had grown to love more than she ever thought possible. "You saved me too," she said softly. "I came here expecting to be useful. Nothing more. I never dreamed I would find a home, a family, a love like this." Jonah kissed her then, slow and sweet, the kiss of a man who had learned to treasure every moment. When they finally pulled apart, the first stars were appearing in the darkening sky. "Come inside," Evelyn said. "Supper is almost ready, and Hannah wants you to help her practice her letters." Jonah smiled, the easy smile of a man at peace. "Lead the way, Mrs. Reed." They walked into the warmth of their home, leaving the door open behind them to let in the evening breeze. Outside, the wind carried the scent of sage and wildflowers across the valley. Cattle lowed in distant pastures. The creek sang its endless song over ancient stones. And in Red Willow Valley, a family that had been built from broken pieces and second chances settled in for another quiet evening, grateful for every blessing, ready for whatever tomorrow might bring. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.